On October 15, 1929, Irving Fisher, the most celebrated economist in American history, stood before a group of bankers in New York and told them the market had reached what looks like a permanently high plateau. 9 days later, the market collapsed. In 4 days, $30 billion in equity was gone. In today's money, more than $500 billion wiped out. Fisher lost everything. His personal fortune, estimated at $10 million, built over a lifetime, was destroyed. His reputation never recovered. But here is what the history books left out. Fisher had been warning about dangerous debt levels in the American economy for years. His work was documented. And when he developed the definitive theory explaining how financial collapses spiral, a framework so accurate it would eventually form the foundation of every major central bank response to crisis, the Federal Reserve and the economics establishment buried it for 50 years. They didn't need to silence him loudly. They just needed to make sure no one listened. Fisher was not the last man this happened to. If that interests you, subscribe to the channel and like this video, because this channel covers what most people slept through. By 1929, Irving Fisher was not a fringe voice. He was, by most measures, the most important economist the United States had ever produced. He held a chair at Yale. His 1892 doctoral dissertation on mathematical economics is still cited as foundational in the field. He developed the Fisher equation, the documented relationship between nominal interest rates, real returns, and inflation that is taught in every introductory economics course on earth. The Federal Reserve used his models. Presidents quoted his analysis. The New York Times ran his projections on the front page. This was a man with more institutional credibility than almost anyone alive in 1929. And the 1920s seemed to confirm everything the establishment believed about itself. American industrial production was up. Wages were rising. The stock market had tripled in under a decade. The Dow Jones Industrial Average climbed from 66 points in 1921 to nearly 400 by September 1929. For the majority of professional economists, this was not speculation. It was progress. The United States, they argued, had entered a new era of managed prosperity. Fisher believed it. He was personally invested. Through his holdings in Remington Rand, the office equipment company, he was directly exposed to the market he was publicly celebrating. This is documented. It matters, because it means what Fisher said in October 1929 was not pure analysis. It was, in part, what he needed to believe. But Fisher had also, for years, been publishing work that told a different story. Throughout the 1920s, his research on debt dynamics, on the relationship between credit expansion and asset prices, on what he called over-indebtedness, pointed toward a system under structural strain. He understood, better than most, how debt compounds, how asset prices built on borrowed money can reverse faster than they build, how a system that depends on continued borrowing becomes fragile the moment credit tightens. He had the framework. He had the data. He had the credentials. What he lacked in October 1929 was the distance from his own financial position to say what the data actually showed. 9 days after the permanently high plateau statement, the market began to break. By the time it stopped falling, 4 years later, in 1933, the Dow had lost 89% of its value. Unemployment in the United States reached 25%. Roughly 9,000 banks failed. 15 million Americans were out of work. Irving Fisher lost every dollar. He was kept solvent only because Yale purchased his house and leased it back to him. He spent the rest of his life working to understand exactly what had happened. And what he found was something the establishment did not want to hear. In 1933, at the depths of the Great Depression, when the banking system was effectively paralyzed, Irving Fisher published a paper. Its title, The Debt-Deflation Theory of Great Depressions. The paper argued something specific. something that contradicted the prevailing policy response being recommended by the economics establishment. Fisher's documented argument: the primary driver of economic depressions was not business cycles, not overproduction, not external shocks. It was over-indebtedness, followed by debt deflation. The mechanism: when a system accumulates too much debt relative to income, a shock, any shock, causes borrowers to sell assets to pay down what they owe. Selling assets drives down prices. Lower prices increase the real value of remaining debt. Higher real debt causes more selling. More selling causes more deflation. The spiral tightens until the system breaks. Fisher had watched this happen in real time. He had watched banks call in loans. He had watched asset prices collapse not from panic, but from a mechanical process of deleveraging that nobody in power wanted to name or address directly. A paper trail exists. The Federal Reserve's own archives show the policy discussions of the early 1930s. Debt deflation, the mechanism Fisher had now documented, was not the framework they were working from. The dominant school of thought, the one that shaped policy, held that the market needed to clear, that intervention was dangerous, that the proper response to an asset price collapse was to let prices find their natural level. This was the position on record from Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon, who advised President Hoover to liquidate labor, liquidate stocks, liquidate the farmers. Let it burn, and the strong will survive. Fisher's theory demanded the opposite: aggressive monetary expansion, debt restructuring, stopping the deflationary spiral by injecting money into the system. The Federal Reserve had the tools. The theory, as Fisher documented it, was clear. They didn't implement it. Now move forward 7 decades. August 2005. Jackson Hole, Wyoming. The Federal Reserve hosts its annual economic symposium, the most prestigious gathering of central bankers and economists in the world. That year's conference was a tribute to outgoing Fed Chairman Alan Greenspan, regarded at the time as the most skilled monetary policymaker in modern history. A 42-year-old economist named Raghuram Rajan, then chief economist of the International Monetary Fund, delivered a paper. Its title: Has Financial Development Made the World Riskier? The answer, the paper argued, was yes, documented, on record. Rajan's analysis identified a structural problem in the financial system that most of the room had spent years celebrating. Financial innovation, complex derivatives, mortgage-backed securities, collateralized debt obligations had not distributed risk safely throughout the economy, as was the official position. According to the internal logic of Rajan's documented analysis, these instruments had concentrated risk invisibly. The incentive structures of the banks that created and traded them rewarded short-term performance and obscured long-term exposure. The system was accumulating hidden fragility at a rate nobody was measuring. The paper named the mechanism. It named the incentive distortions. It documented the specific structures, the same structures that would, 3 years later, detonate into the largest financial crisis since 1929. Then, 1 month later, September 2006, an economist at New York University named Nouriel Roubini stood before the International Monetary Fund. The transcript exists. He projected a chain of events: a collapse in used housing prices, a wave of mortgage defaults, a freezing of credit markets, and a global recession. He named the mechanism. He documented the exposure. He put it on the record. 3 warnings, 3 documented papers, 3 economists who followed the data where it led. The public story in each case followed the same pattern. With Fisher, the permanently high plateau quote became the story. A man who had said stocks were at a permanently high plateau just before the greatest crash in history. The quote was repeated endlessly in newspaper columns, in textbook footnotes, in academic papers, always as a punchline. It became the single defining fact of Fisher's career. The debt deflation paper was not the story. The documented research connecting over-indebtedness to depressionary spirals, the work that would eventually guide every major central bank response to every major financial crisis for the next century, was quietly filed, not suppressed loudly, simply not amplified, not taught, not operationalized. The Federal Reserve developed its own frameworks. Fisher's name remained attached to a different narrative. The official position in the 1930s, documented in Federal Reserve Board minutes from the period. Monetary policy had done what it could. The Depression was a necessary correction. This framing protected the institution. It did not protect the 15 million Americans who were unemployed. With Rajan in 2005, the cover was credentialing. The man in the room with the most institutional authority, Lawrence Summers, former Treasury Secretary, former president of Harvard, stood up and publicly called Rajan's analysis misguided. He used the word Luddite, a deliberate insult, framing Rajan's concerns about financial complexity as technophobia. Donald Cohn, the Federal Reserve's vice chairman, offered similar pushback. The consensus in the room, according to contemporaneous accounts, was that Rajan was being alarmist. The meeting ended. The paper was filed. The financial system continued building exactly the structures Rajan had flagged. With Roubini, the mechanism was labeling. The name that followed him from the IMF presentation forward was Dr. Doom. Not a rebuttal of his data, not a counterpaper, not a documented refutation of his methodology. A name designed to communicate that his analysis was not economics but psychology, not data but temperament, not a warning but a personality flaw. The paper trail in each case leads to the same place. When an economist produced documented evidence of systemic risk, evidence that demanded an institutional response, the institution's first move was to discredit the economist, not the data, the person. The official line from the Fed throughout 2006 and 2007, documented in press releases, in congressional testimony, in public statements from Chairman Bernanke, was that the housing market was experiencing a correction that was likely to be contained. The word contained appears in Federal Reserve communications in reference to the subprime mortgage market multiple times across this period, as the files on record show. The warnings existed. The record shows they existed. The question the record could not answer, in real time, was why the institution chose the label over the data. September 15, 2008. Lehman Brothers files for bankruptcy. $613 billion in liabilities. The largest corporate bankruptcy in American history. What followed is documented. Between 2007 and 2010, American households lost an estimated $13 trillion in net worth. Housing values fell an average of 30% nationally. In markets like Las Vegas, Phoenix, and parts of Florida and California, they fell more than 50%. 8 million Americans lost their jobs. 6 million lost their homes. Unemployment peaked at 10% in October 2009. It did not return to pre-crisis levels until 2016, the slowest economic recovery since the Great Depression. The Federal Reserve, faced with a collapsing financial system, implemented a policy response. Emergency lending facilities, quantitative easing, near zero interest rates maintained for 7 years. The theoretical foundation for this response, the framework that justified aggressive monetary intervention rather than allowing a deflationary spiral to run its course, was documented in a November 2002 speech by then-Governor Ben Bernanke. In that speech, Bernanke explicitly cited Irving Fisher. He called Fisher's 1933 Debt-Deflation paper one of the path-breaking works that shaped his thinking. He referenced Fisher's mechanism, over-indebtedness, asset deflation, the self-reinforcing spiral, as the analytical basis for why the Fed could not simply stand aside. The framework that had been filed and not operationalized for 50 years became, in 2008, the intellectual backbone of the largest monetary policy intervention in American history. Rajan's 2005 paper similarly, was retrospectively elevated. Academic citations spiked. He was awarded the Fisher Black Prize, among the highest honors in financial economics. The IMF published analyses acknowledging that his 2005 warning had accurately described what happened. The acknowledgement came after the damage was done. In 2010, Roubini co-authored a book called Crisis Economics. The same analysis that earned him the Dr. Doom label in 2006 was now being studied in university finance departments across the world. These are documented outcomes. Fisher's theory, validated and implemented 50 years after he wrote it. Rajan's warning, acknowledged 3 years after it was dismissed as the work of a Luddite. Roubini's projections, confirmed in the wreckage of 8 million jobs and 6 million homes. The cost of the delay is also documented. The decade following 2008. Wage growth flat for most American workers through 2015. Median household wealth did not return to 2007 levels until 2016. The housing crisis effectively locked a generation out of homeownership. Household formation rates among Americans aged 25 to 34 collapsed and did not recover for nearly a decade. These numbers are not abstract. They represent specific, quantifiable outcomes that flow from specific, documented decisions made in the window when the warnings were available on the record and dismissed. This is not a historical problem. The mechanism that silenced Fisher in 1933 and Rajan in 2005 is institutional, not personal. It is a function of how expertise is credentialed, how dissent is handled, and who bears the cost when the consensus is wrong. The pattern, documented across all three cases. An economist outside the inner ring of institutional decision-making produces evidence of systemic risk. The inner ring responds not by engaging with the evidence, but by establishing that the person producing the evidence is not the kind of person whose evidence should be taken seriously. The label does the work. Luddite, Dr. Doom, Permabear. The data becomes associated with the character of the person presenting it, and the character is found wanting. This is not conspiracy. It is a documented incentive structure. The people in those rooms at Jackson Hole in 2005, at the Fed in 1933, had built their careers on the frameworks being challenged. They were invested in the system they were being asked to critique. The professional cost of agreeing with Rajan in 2005 was higher in that room than the cost of dismissing him. Irving Fisher's debt-deflation theory is now taught in every graduate economics program. Rajan's 2005 paper is treated as a landmark in financial stability research. Roubini's 2006 IMF presentation is a case study in accurate forecasting. What none of that recognition does is rebuild the $13 trillion in household wealth that was destroyed, or return the 8 million jobs, or give back the homes. The question the record leaves open is this: what warnings are being filed right now? The files will show eventually. They always do. The paper trail leads somewhere. The question is whether anyone follows it before the market moves. Most people slept through this. You didn't. Subscribe, because there's more.